Book the Third, Chapter 4 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Storm. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Book the Third, Chapter 4, Allan at Bay. 2 o'clock came, and Pedgift Junior, punctual to his time, came with it. His vivacity of the morning had all sparkled out. He greeted Allan with his customary politeness, but without his customary smile, and when the head waiter came in for orders, his dismissal was instantly pronounced in words never yet heard to issue from the lips of Pedgift in that hotel. "Nothing at present." "You seem to be in low spirits," said Allan. "Can't we get our information? Can nobody tell you anything about the house in Pimlico?" "3 different people have told me about it, Mr. Armadale, and they have all 3 said the same thing." Allan eagerly drew his chair nearer to the place occupied by his travelling companion. His reflections in the interval since they had last seen each other had not tended to compose him. That strange connection, so easy to feel, so hard to trace, between the difficulty of approaching Miss Gwilt's family circumstances and the difficulty of approaching Miss Gwilt's reference, which had already established itself in his thoughts, had by this time stealthily taken a firmer and firmer hold on his mind. Doubts troubled him which he could neither understand nor express. Curiosity filled him, which he half longed and half dreaded to satisfy. "I'm afraid I must trouble you with a question or two, sir, before I can come to the point," said Pedgift Junior. "I don't want to force myself into your confidence. I only want to see my way in what looks to me like a very awkward business. Do you mind telling me whether others besides yourself are interested in this inquiry of ours?" "Other people are interested in it," replied Allan. "There's no objection to telling you that." "Is there any other person who is the object of the inquiry besides Mrs. Mandeville herself?" pursued Pedgift, winding his way a little deeper into the secret. "Yes, there is another person," said Allan, answering rather unwillingly. "Is the person a young woman, Mr. Armadale?" Allan started. "How do you come to guess that?" he began, then checked himself when it was too late. "Don't ask me any more questions," he resumed. "I'm a bad hand at defending myself against a sharp fellow like you, and I'm bound in honor toward other people to keep the particulars of this business to myself." Pedgift Junior had apparently heard enough for his purpose. He drew his chair, in his turn, nearer to Allan. He was evidently anxious and embarrassed, but his professional manner began to show itself again from sheer force of habit. "I've done with my questions, sir," he said, "and I have something to say now on my side. In my father's absence, perhaps you may be kindly disposed to consider me as your legal adviser. If you will take my advice, you will not stir another step in this inquiry." "What do you mean?" interposed Allan. "It is just possible, Mr. Armadale, that the cabman, positive as he is, may have been mistaken. I strongly recommend you to take it for granted that he is mistaken, and to drop it there." The caution was kindly intended, but it came too late. Allan did what 99 men out of 100 in his position would have done. He declined to take his lawyer's advice. "Very well, sir," said Pedgift Junior. "If you will have it, you must have it." He leaned forward close to Allan's ear, and whispered what he had heard of the house in Pimlico, and of the people who occupied it. "Don't blame me, Mr. Armadale," he added, when the irrevocable words had been spoken. "I tried to spare you." Allan suffered the shock, as all great shocks are suffered, in silence. His first impulse would have driven him headlong for refuge to that very view of the cabman's assertion which had just been recommended to him, but for one damning circumstance which placed itself inexorably in his way. Miss Gwilt's marked reluctance to approach the story of her past life rose irrepressibly on his memory, in indirect but horrible confirmation of the evidence which connected Miss Gwilt's reference with the house in Pimlico. One conclusion, and one only, the conclusion which any man must have drawn, hearing what he had just heard, and knowing no more than he knew, forced itself into his mind. A miserable fallen woman, who had abandoned herself in her extremity to the help of wretches skilled in criminal concealment, who had stolen her way back to decent society and a reputable employment by means of a false character, and whose position now imposed on her the dreadful necessity of perpetual secrecy and perpetual deceit in relation to her past life. Such was the aspect in which the beautiful governess at Thorpe Ambrose now stood revealed to Allan's eyes. Falsely revealed or truly revealed? Had she stolen her way back to decent society and a reputable employment by means of a false character? She had. Did her position impose on her the dreadful necessity of perpetual secrecy and perpetual deceit in relation to her past life? It did. Was she some such pitiable victim to the treachery of a man unknown, as Allan had supposed? She was no such pitiable victim. The conclusion which Allan had drawn, the conclusion literally forced into his mind by the facts before him, was nevertheless the conclusion of all others that was furthest even from touching on the truth. The true story of Miss Gwilt's connection with the house in Pimlico and the people who inhabited it, a house rightly described as filled with wicked secrets and people rightly represented as perpetually in danger of feeling the grasp of the law, was a story which coming events were yet to disclose, a story infinitely less revolting and yet infinitely more terrible than Allan or Allan's companion had either of them supposed. "I tried to spare you, Mr. Armadale," repeated Pedgift. "I was anxious, if I could possibly avoid it, not to distress you." Allan looked up, and made an effort to control himself. "You have distressed me dreadfully," he said. "You have quite crushed me down, but it is not your fault. I ought to feel you have done me a service, and what I ought to do I will do, when I am my own man again. There is one thing," Allan added, after a moment's painful consideration, "which ought to be understood between us at once. The advice you offered me just now was very kindly meant, and it was the best advice that could be given. I will take it gratefully. We will never talk of this again, if you please, and I beg and entreat you will never speak about it to any other person. Will you promise me that?" Pedgift gave the promise with very evident sincerity, but without his professional confidence of manner. The distress in Allan's face seemed to daunt him. After a moment of very uncharacteristic hesitation, he considerately quitted the room. Left by himself, Allan rang for writing materials, and took out of his pocket-book the fatal letter of introduction to Mrs. Mandeville, which he had received from the major's wife. A man accustomed to consider consequences, and to prepare himself for action by previous thought, would, in Allan's present circumstances, have felt some difficulty as to the course which it might now be least embarrassing and least dangerous to pursue. Accustomed to let his impulses direct him on all other occasions, Allan acted on impulse in the serious emergency that now confronted him. Though his attachment to Miss Gwilt was nothing like the deeply rooted feeling which he had himself honestly believed it to be, she had taken no common place in his admiration, and she filled him with no common grief when he thought of her now. His one dominant desire, at that critical moment in his life, was a man's merciful desire to protect from exposure and ruin the unhappy woman who had lost her place in his estimation, without losing her claim to the forbearance that could spare, and to the compassion that could shield her. "I can't go back to Thorpe Ambrose. I can't trust myself to speak to her or to see her again, but I can keep her miserable secret, and I will." With that thought in his heart, Allan set himself to perform the first and foremost duty which now claimed him, the duty of communicating with Mrs. Milroy. If he had possessed a higher mental capacity and a clearer mental view, he might have found the letter no easy one to write. As it was, he calculated no consequences, and felt no difficulty. His instinct warned him to withdraw at once from the position in which he now stood toward the major's wife, and he wrote what his instinct counselled him to write under those circumstances, as rapidly as the pen could travel over the paper. "Dunn's Hotel, Covent Garden, Tuesday. Dear Madam, pray excuse my not returning to Thorpe Ambrose to-day, as I said I would. Unforeseen circumstances oblige me to stop in London. I am sorry to say I have not succeeded in seeing Mrs. Mandeville, for which reason I cannot perform your errand, and I beg therefore, with many apologies, to return the letter of introduction. I hope you will allow me to conclude by saying that I am very much obliged to you for your kindness, and that I will not venture to trespass on it any further. I remain, dear Madam, yours truly, Allan Armadale. In those artless words, still entirely unsuspicious of the character of the woman he had to deal with, Allan put the weapon she wanted into Mrs. Milroy's hands. The letter and its enclosure once sealed up and addressed, he was free to think of himself and his future. As he sat idly drawing lines with his pen on the blotting paper, the tears came into his eyes for the first time, tears in which the woman who had deceived him had no share. His heart had gone back to his dead mother. If she had been alive, he thought, I might have trusted her, and she would have comforted me. It was useless to dwell on it. He dashed away the tears, and turned his thoughts, with the heartsick resignation that we all know, to living and present things. He wrote a line to Mr. Bashwood, briefly informing the deputy steward that his absence from Thorpe Ambrose was likely to be prolonged for some little time, and that any further instructions which might be necessary under those circumstances would reach him through Mr. Pedgift the elder. This done, and the letters sent to the post, his thoughts were forced back once more on himself. Again the blank future waited before him to be filled up, and again his heart shrank from it to the refuge of the past. This time other images than the image of his mother filled his mind. The one all-absorbing interest of his earlier days stirred living and eager in him again. He thought of the sea, he thought of his yacht lying idle in the fishing harbour at his west country home. The old longing got possession of him to hear the wash of the waves, to see the filling of the sails, to feel the vessel that his own hands had helped to build bounding under him once more. He rose in his impetuous way to call for the time-table, and to start for Somersetshire by the first train, when the dread of the questions which Mr. Brock might ask, the suspicion of the change which Mr. Brock might see in him, drew him back to his chair. "I'll write," he thought, "to have the yacht rigged and refitted, and I'll wait to go to Somersetshire myself till Midwinter can go with me." He sighed as his memory reverted to his absent friend. Never had he felt the void made in his life by Midwinter's departure so painfully as he felt it now, in the dreariest of all social solitudes, the solitude of a stranger in London, left by himself at a hotel. Before long, Pedgift Junior looked in, with an apology for his intrusion. Allan felt too lonely and too friendless not to welcome his companion's reappearance gratefully. "I'm not going back to Thorpe Ambrose," he said. "I'm going to stay a little while in London. I hope you will be able to stay with me." To do him justice, Pedgift was touched by the solitary position in which the owner of the great Thorpe Ambrose estate now appeared before him. He had never in his relations with Allan so entirely forgotten his business interests as he forgot them now. "You are quite right, sir, to stop here. London's the place to divert your mind," said Pedgift cheerfully. "All business is more or less elastic in its nature, Mr. Armadale. I'll spin my business out, and keep you company with the greatest pleasure. We are both of us on the right side of 30, sir. Let's enjoy ourselves. What do you say to dining early, and going to the play, and trying the great exhibition in Hyde Park to-morrow morning after breakfast? If we only live like fighting cocks, and go in perpetually for public amusements, we shall arrive in no time at the mens sana in corpore sano of the ancients. Don't be alarmed at the quotation, sir. I dabble a little in Latin after business hours, and enlarge my sympathies by occasional perusal of the pagan writers, assisted by a crib. William, dinner at 5, and as it's particularly important to-day, I'll see the cook myself." The evening passed, the next day passed, Thursday morning came, and brought with it a letter for Allan. The direction was in Mrs. Milroy's handwriting, and the form of address adopted in the letter warned Allan, the moment he opened it, that something had gone wrong. Private. The Cottage, Thorpe Ambrose, Wednesday. Sir, I have just received your mysterious letter. It has more than surprised me, it has really alarmed me. After having made the friendliest advances to you on my side, I find myself suddenly shut out from your confidence in the most unintelligible, and, I must add, the most discourteous manner. It is quite impossible that I can allow the matter to rest where you have left it. The only conclusion I can draw from your letter is that my confidence must have been abused in some way, and that you know a great deal more than you are willing to tell me. Speaking in the interest of my daughter's welfare, I request that you will inform me what the circumstances are which have prevented your seeing Mrs. Mandeville, and which have led to the withdrawal of the assistance that you unconditionally promised me in your letter of Monday last. In my state of health, I cannot involve myself in a lengthened correspondence. I must endeavor to anticipate any objections you may make, and I must say all that I have to say in my present letter. In the event, which I am most unwilling to consider possible, of your declining to accede to the request that I have just addressed to you, I beg to say that I shall consider it my duty to my daughter to have this very unpleasant matter cleared up. If I don't hear from you to my full satisfaction by return of post, I shall be obliged to tell my husband that circumstances have happened which justify us in immediately testing the respectability of Miss Gwilt's reference; and when he asks me for my authority, I will refer him to you. Your obedient servant, Anne Milroy. In those terms the major's wife threw off the mask, and left her victim to survey at his leisure the trap in which she had caught him. Allan's belief in Mrs. Milroy's good faith had been so implicitly sincere that her letter simply bewildered him. He saw vaguely that he had been deceived in some way, and that Mrs. Milroy's neighborly interest in him was not what it had looked on the surface, and he saw no more. The threat of appealing to the major, on which, with a woman's ignorance of the natures of men, Mrs. Milroy had relied for producing its effect, was the only part of the letter to which Allan reverted with any satisfaction. It relieved him instead of alarming him. If there is to be a quarrel, he thought, it will be a comfort at any rate to have it out with a man. Firm in his resolution to shield the unhappy woman whose secret he wrongly believed himself to have surprised, Allan sat down to write his apologies to the major's wife. After setting up 3 polite declarations, in close marching order, he retired from the field. He was extremely sorry to have offended Mrs. Milroy. He was innocent of all intention to offend Mrs. Milroy, and he begged to remain Mrs. Milroy's truly. Never had Allan's habitual brevity as a letter-writer done him better service than it did him now. With a little more skilfulness in the use of his pen, he might have given his enemy even a stronger hold on him than the hold she had got already. The interval day passed, and with the next morning's post, Mrs. Milroy's threat came realized in the shape of a letter from her husband. The major wrote less formally than his wife had written, but his questions were mercilessly to the point. Private. The Cottage, Thorpe Ambrose, Friday, July 11, 1851. Dear Sir, when you did me the favour of calling here a few days since, you asked a question relating to my governess, Miss Gwilt, which I thought rather a strange one at the time, and which caused, as you may remember, a momentary embarrassment between us. This morning the subject of Miss Gwilt has been brought to my notice again, in a manner which has caused me the utmost astonishment. In plain words, Mrs. Milroy has informed me that Miss Gwilt has exposed herself to the suspicion of having deceived us by a false reference. On my expressing the surprise which such an extraordinary statement caused me, and requesting that it might be instantly substantiated, I was still further astonished by being told to apply for all particulars to no less a person than Mr. Armadale. I have vainly requested some further explanation from Mrs. Milroy. She persists in maintaining silence, and in referring me to yourself. Under these extraordinary circumstances, I am compelled, in justice to all parties, to ask you certain questions, which I will endeavor to put as plainly as possible, and which I am quite ready to believe, from my previous experience of you, that you will answer frankly on your side. I beg to inquire, in the first place, whether you admit or deny Mrs. Milroy's assertion that you have made yourself acquainted with particulars relating either to Miss Gwilt or to Miss Gwilt's reference, of which I am entirely ignorant. In the second place, if you admit the truth of Mrs. Milroy's statement, I request to know how you became acquainted with those particulars. Thirdly and lastly, I beg to ask you what the particulars are. If any special justification for putting these questions be needed, which, purely as a matter of courtesy toward yourself, I am willing to admit, I beg to remind you that the most precious charge in my house, the charge of my daughter, is confided to Miss Gwilt, and that Mrs. Milroy's statement places you, to all appearance, in the position of being competent to tell me whether that charge is properly bestowed or not. I have only to add that, as nothing has thus far occurred to justify me in entertaining the slightest suspicion either of my governess or her reference, I shall wait before I make any appeal to Miss Gwilt until I have received your answer, which I shall expect by return of post. Believe me, dear sir, faithfully yours, David Milroy. This transparently straightforward letter at once dissipated the confusion which had thus far existed in Allan's mind. He saw the snare in which he had been caught, though he was still necessarily at a loss to understand why it had been set for him, as he had not seen it yet. Mrs. Milroy had clearly placed him between two alternatives: the alternative of putting himself in the wrong by declining to answer her husband's questions, or the alternative of meanly sheltering his responsibility behind the responsibility of a woman, by acknowledging to the major's own face that the major's wife had deceived him. In this difficulty Allan acted as usual, without hesitation. His pledge to Mrs. Milroy to consider their correspondence private still bound him, disgracefully as she had abused it; and his resolution was as immovable as ever to let no earthly consideration tempt him into betraying Miss Gwilt. "I may have behaved like a fool," he thought, "but I won't break my word, and I won't be the means of turning that miserable woman adrift in the world again." He wrote to the major as artlessly and briefly as he had written to the major's wife. He declared his unwillingness to cause a friend and neighbor any disappointment if he could possibly help it. On this occasion he had no other choice. The questions the major asked him were questions which he could not consent to answer. He was not very clever at explaining himself, and he hoped he might be excused for putting it in that way and saying no more. Monday's post brought with it Major Milroy's rejoinder, and closed the correspondence. The Cottage, Thorpe Ambrose, Sunday. Sir, your refusal to answer my questions, unaccompanied as it is by even the shadow of an excuse for such a proceeding, can be interpreted but in one way. Besides being an implied acknowledgment of the correctness of Mrs. Milroy's statement, it is also an implied reflection on my governess's character. As an act of justice toward a lady who lives under the protection of my roof, and who has given me no reason whatever to distrust her, I shall now show our correspondence to Miss Gwilt, and I shall repeat to her the conversation which I had with Mrs. Milroy on the subject, in Mrs. Milroy's presence. One word more respecting the future relations between us, and I have done. My ideas on certain subjects are, I dare say, the ideas of an old-fashioned man. In my time we had a code of honor by which we regulated our actions. According to that code, if a man made private inquiries into a lady's affairs, without being either her husband, her father, or her brother, he subjected himself to the responsibility of justifying his conduct in the estimation of others, and, if he evaded that responsibility, he abdicated the position of a gentleman. It is quite possible that this antiquated way of thinking exists no longer, but it is too late for me at my time of life to adopt more modern views. I am scrupulously anxious, seeing that we live in a country and a time in which the only court of honor is a police court, to express myself with the utmost moderation of language upon this the last occasion that I shall have to communicate with you. Allow me therefore merely to remark that our ideas of the conduct which is becoming in a gentleman differ seriously, and permit me on this account to request that you will consider yourself for the future as a stranger to my family and to myself. Your obedient servant, David Milroy. The Monday morning on which his client received the major's letter was the blackest morning that had yet been marked in Pedgift's calendar. When Allan's first angry sense of the tone of contempt in which his friend and neighbor pronounced sentence on him had subsided, it left him sunk in a state of depression from which no efforts made by his traveling companion could rouse him for the rest of the day. Reverting naturally, now that his sentence of banishment had been pronounced, to his early intercourse with the cottage, his memory went back to Neelie more regretfully and more penitently than it had gone back to her yet. "If she had shut the door on me instead of her father," was the bitter reflection with which Allan now reviewed the past, "I shouldn't have had a word to say against it. I should have felt it served me right." The next day brought another letter, a welcome letter this time, from Mr. Brock. Allan had written to Somersetshire on the subject of refitting the yacht some days since. The letter had found the rector engaged, as he innocently supposed, in protecting his old pupil against a woman whom he had watched in London, and whom he now believed to have followed him back to his own home. Acting under the directions sent to her, Mrs. Oldershaw's housemaid had completed the mystification of Mr. Brock. She had tranquilized all further anxiety on the rector's part by giving him a written undertaking, in the character of Miss Gwilt, engaging never to approach Mr. Armadale, either personally or by letter. Firmly persuaded that he had won the victory at last, poor Mr. Brock answered Allan's note in the highest spirits, expressing some natural surprise at his leaving Thorpe Ambrose, but readily promising that the yacht should be refitted, and offering the hospitality of the rectory in the heartiest manner. This letter did wonders in raising Allan's spirits. It gave him a new interest to look to, entirely disassociated from his past life in Norfolk. He began to count the days that were still to pass before the return of his absent friend. It was then Tuesday. If Midwinter came back from his walking trip, as he had engaged to come back in a fortnight, Saturday would find him at Thorpe Ambrose. A note sent to meet the traveller might bring him to London the same night, and, if all went well, before another week was over they might be afloat together in the yacht. The next day passed, to Allan's relief, without bringing any letters. The spirits of Pedgift rose sympathetically with the spirits of his client. Toward dinner time he reverted to the mens sana in corpore sano of the ancients, and issued his orders to the head waiter more royally than ever. Thursday came, and brought the fatal postman with more news from Norfolk. A letter writer now stepped on the scene, who had not appeared there yet, and the total overthrow of all Allan's plans for a visit to Somersetshire was accomplished on the spot. Pedgift Junior happened that morning to be the first at the breakfast table. When Allan came in, he relapsed into his professional manner, and offered a letter to his patron with a bow performed in dreary silence. "For me?" inquired Allan, shrinking instinctively from a new correspondent. "For you, sir, from my father," replied Pedgift, "enclosed in one to myself. Perhaps you will allow me to suggest, by way of preparing you for something a little unpleasant, that we shall want a particularly good dinner to-day, and, if they're not performing any modern German music to-night, I think we should do well to finish the evening melodiously at the opera." "Something wrong at Thorpe Ambrose?" asked Allan. "Yes, Mr. Armadale, something wrong at Thorpe Ambrose." Allan sat down resignedly and opened the letter. "Private and confidential. High Street, Thorpe Ambrose, 17th July, 1851. "Dear Sir, I cannot reconcile it with my sense of duty to your interests to leave you any longer in ignorance of reports current in this town and its neighborhood, which, I regret to say, are reports affecting yourself. The first intimation of anything unpleasant reached me on Monday last. It was widely rumored in the town that something had gone wrong at Major Milroy's with the new governess, and that Mr. Armadale was mixed up in it. I paid no heed to this, believing it to be one of the many trumpery pieces of scandal perpetually set going here, and as necessary as the air they breathe to the comfort of the inhabitants of this highly respectable place. Tuesday, however, put the matter in a new light. The most interesting particulars were circulated on the highest authority. On Wednesday, the gentry in the neighborhood took the matter up, and universally sanctioned the views adopted by the town. To-day the public feeling has reached its climax, and I find myself under the necessity of making you acquainted with what has happened. To begin at the beginning, it is asserted that a correspondence took place last week between Major Milroy and yourself, in which you cast a very serious suspicion on Miss Gwilt's respectability, without defining your accusations, and without, on being applied to, producing your proofs. Upon this, the Major appears to have felt it his duty, while assuring his governess of his own firm belief in her respectability, to inform her of what had happened, in order that she might have no future reason to complain of his having had any concealments from her in a matter affecting her character. Very magnanimous on the Major's part, but you will see directly that Miss Gwilt was more magnanimous still. After expressing her thanks in a most becoming manner, she requested permission to withdraw herself from Major Milroy's service. Various reports are in circulation as to the governess's reason for taking this step. The authorized version, as sanctioned by the resident gentry, represents Miss Gwilt to have said that she could not condescend, in justice to herself and in justice to her highly respectable reference, to defend her reputation against undefined imputations cast on it by a comparative stranger. At the same time, it was impossible for her to pursue such a course of conduct as this, unless she possessed a freedom of action which was quite incompatible with her continuing to occupy the dependent position of a governess. For that reason she felt it incumbent on her to leave her situation, but, while doing this, she was equally determined not to lead to any misinterpretation of her motives by leaving the neighborhood. No matter at what inconvenience to herself, she would remain long enough at Thorpe Ambrose to await any more definitely expressed imputations that might be made on her character, and to repel them publicly the instant they assumed a tangible form. Such is the position which this high-minded lady has taken up, with an excellent effect on the public mind in these parts. It is clearly her interest, for some reason, to leave her situation without leaving the neighborhood. On Monday last she established herself in a cheap lodging on the outskirts of the town, and on the same day she probably wrote to her reference, for yesterday there came a letter from that lady to Major Milroy, full of virtuous indignation, and courting the fullest inquiry. The letter has been shown publicly, and has immensely strengthened Miss Gwilt's position. She is now considered to be quite a heroine. The Thorpe Ambrose Mercury has got a leading article about her, comparing her to Joan of Arc. It is considered probable that she will be referred to in the sermon next Sunday. We reckon 5 strong-minded single ladies in this neighborhood, and all 5 have called on her. A testimonial was suggested, but it has been given up at Miss Gwilt's own request, and a general movement is now on foot to get her employment as a teacher of music. Lastly, I have had the honor of a visit from the lady herself, in her capacity of martyr, to tell me in the sweetest manner that she doesn't blame Mr. Armadale, and that she considers him to be an innocent instrument in the hands of other and more designing people. I was carefully on my guard with her, for I don't altogether believe in Miss Gwilt, and I have my lawyer's suspicions of the motive that is at the bottom of her present proceedings. I have written thus far, my dear sir, with little hesitation or embarrassment, but there is unfortunately a serious side to this business, as well as a ridiculous side, and I must unwillingly come to it before I close my letter. It is, I think, quite impossible that you can permit yourself to be spoken of as you are spoken of now, without stirring personally in the matter. You have unluckily made many enemies here, and foremost among them is my colleague, Mr. Darch. He has been showing everywhere a somewhat rashly expressed letter you wrote to him on the subject of letting the cottage to Major Milroy instead of to himself, and it has helped to exasperate the feeling against you. It is roundly stated in so many words that you have been prying into Miss Gwilt's family affairs with the most dishonorable motives, that you have tried, for a profligate purpose of your own, to damage her reputation, and to deprive her of the protection of Major Milroy's roof; and that after having been asked to substantiate by proof the suspicions that you have cast on the reputation of a defenseless woman, you have maintained a silence which condemns you in the estimation of all honorable men. I hope it is quite unnecessary for me to say that I don't attach the smallest particle of credit to these infamous reports, but they are too widely spread and too widely believed to be treated with contempt. I strongly urge you to return at once to this place, and to take the necessary measures for defending your character, in concert with me as your legal adviser. I have formed, since my interview with Miss Gwilt, a very strong opinion of my own on the subject of that lady, which it is not necessary to commit to paper. Suffice it to say here that I shall have a means to propose to you for silencing the slanderous tongues of your neighbors, on the success of which I stake my professional reputation, if you will only back me by your presence and authority. It may perhaps help to show you the necessity there is for your return, if I mention one other assertion respecting yourself, which is in everybody's mouth. Your absence is, I regret to tell you, attributed to the meanest of all motives. It is said that you are remaining in London because you are afraid to show your face at Thorpe Ambrose. Believe me, dear sir, your faithful servant, A. Pedgift, Senior. Allan was of an age to feel the sting contained in the last sentence of his lawyer's letter. He started to his feet in a paroxysm of indignation, which revealed his character to Pedgift Junior in an entirely new light. "Where's the time-table?" cried Allan. "I must go back to Thorpe Ambrose by the next train. If it doesn't start directly, I'll have a special engine. I must and will go back instantly, and I don't care 2 straws for the expense." "Suppose we telegraph to my father, sir?" suggested the judicious Pedgift. "It's the quickest way of expressing your feelings, and the cheapest." "So it is," said Allan. "Thank you for reminding me of it. Telegraph to them. Tell your father to give every man in Thorpe Ambrose the lie direct, in my name. Put it in capital letters, Pedgift, put it in capital letters." Pedgift smiled and shook his head. If he was acquainted with no other variety of human nature, he thoroughly knew the variety that exists in country towns. "It won't have the least effect on them, Mr. Armadale," he remarked quietly. "They'll only go on lying harder than ever. If you want to upset the whole town, one line will do it. With 5 shillings worth of human labor and electric fluid, sir (I dabble a little in science after business hours), we'll explode a bombshell in Thorpe Ambrose." He produced the bombshell on a slip of paper as he spoke. "A. Pedgift, Junior, to A. Pedgift, Senior. Spread it all over the place that Mr. Armadale is coming down by the next train." "More words," suggested Allan, looking over his shoulder. "Make it stronger." "Leave my father to make it stronger, sir," returned the wary Pedgift. "My father is on the spot, and his command of language is something quite extraordinary." He rang the bell and dispatched the telegram. Now that something had been done, Allan subsided gradually into a state of composure. He looked back again at Mr. Pedgift's letter, and then handed it to Mr. Pedgift's son. "Can you guess your father's plan for setting me right in the neighborhood?" he asked. Pedgift the younger shook his wise head. "His plan appears to be connected in some way, sir, with his opinion of Miss Gwilt." "I wonder what he thinks of her," said Allan. "I shouldn't be surprised, Mr. Armadale," returned Pedgift Junior, "if his opinion staggers you a little when you come to hear it. My father has had a large legal experience of the shady side of the sex, and he learned his profession at the Old Bailey." Allan made no further inquiries. He seemed to shrink from pursuing the subject, after having started it himself. "Let's be doing something to kill the time," he said. "Let's pack up and pay the bill." They packed up and paid the bill. The hour came, and the train left for Norfolk at last. While the travelers were on their way back, a somewhat longer telegraphic message than Allan's was flashing its way past them along the wires, in the reverse direction, from Thorpe Ambrose to London. The message was in cipher, and, the signs being interpreted, it ran thus: "From Lydia Gwilt to Maria Oldershaw. Good news! He is coming back. I mean to have an interview with him. Everything looks well. Now I have left the cottage, I have no women's prying eyes to dread, and I can come and go as I please. Mr. Midwinter is luckily out of the way. I don't despair of becoming Mrs. Armadale yet. Whatever happens, depend on my keeping away from London until I am certain of not taking any spies after me to your place. I am in no hurry to leave Thorpe Ambrose. I mean to be even with Miss Milroy first." Shortly after that message was received in London, Allan was back again in his own house. It was evening. Pedgift Junior had just left him, and Pedgift Senior was expected to call on business in half an hour's time. End of Chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 5. Pedgift's Remedy. After waiting to hold a preliminary consultation with his son, Mr. Pedgift, the elder, set forth alone for his interview with Allan at the great house. Allowing for the difference in their ages, the son was, in this instance, so accurately the reflection of the father, that an acquaintance with either of the two Pedgifts was almost equivalent to an acquaintance with both. Add some little height and size to the figure of Pedgift Junior, give more breadth and boldness to his humour, and some additional solidity and composure to his confidence in himself, and the presence and character of Pedgift Senior stood, for all general purposes, revealed before you. The lawyer's conveyance to Thorpe Ambrose was his own smart gig, drawn by his famous fast-trotting mare. It was his habit to drive himself, and it was one among the trifling external peculiarities in which he and his son differed a little, to affect something of the sporting character in his dress. The drab trousers of Pedgift the elder fitted close to his legs; his boots, in dry weather and wet alike, were equally thick in the sole; his coat pockets overlapped his hips, and his favourite summer cravat was of light spotted muslin, tied in the neatest and smallest of bows. He used tobacco like his son, but in a different form. While the younger man smoked, the elder took snuff copiously, and it was noticed among his intimates that he always held his pinch in a state of suspense between his box and his nose when he was going to clinch a good bargain or to say a good thing. The art of diplomacy enters largely into the practice of all successful men in the lower branch of the law. Mr. Pedgift's form of diplomatic practice had been the same throughout his life. On every occasion when he found his arts of persuasion required at an interview with another man, he invariably kept his strongest argument, or his boldest proposal, to the last, and invariably remembered it at the door, after previously taking his leave, as if it was a purely accidental consideration which had that instant occurred to him. Jocular friends, acquainted by previous experience with this form of proceeding, had given it the name of Pedgift's postscript. There were few people in Thorpe Ambrose who did not know what it meant when the lawyer suddenly checked his exit at the open door, came back softly to his chair, with his pinch of snuff suspended between his box and his nose, said, "By the by, there's a point occurs to me," and settled the question off hand, after having given it up in despair not a minute before. This was the man whom the march of events at Thorpe Ambrose had now thrust capriciously into a foremost place. This was the one friend at hand to whom Allan, in his social isolation, could turn for counsel in the hour of need. "Good evening, Mr. Armadale. Many thanks for your prompt attention to my very disagreeable letter," said Pedgift Senior, opening the conversation cheerfully the moment he entered his client's house. "I hope you understand, sir, that I had really no choice, under the circumstances, but to write as I did?" "I have very few friends, Mr. Pedgift," returned Allan, simply, "and I am sure you are one of the few." "Much obliged, Mr. Armadale. I have always tried to deserve your good opinion. and I mean, if I can, to deserve it now. You found yourself comfortable, I hope, sir, at the hotel in London? We call it our hotel. Some rare old wine in the cellar, which I should have introduced to your notice if I had had the honor of being with you. My son, unfortunately, knows nothing about wine." Allan felt his false position in the neighborhood far too acutely to be capable of talking of anything but the main business of the evening. His lawyer's politely roundabout method of approaching the painful subject to be discussed between them rather irritated than composed him. He came at once to the point, in his own bluntly straightforward way. "The hotel was very comfortable, Mr. Pedgift, and your son was very kind to me. But we are not in London now, and I want to talk to you about how I am to meet the lies that are being told of me in this place." "Only point me out any one man," cried Allan, with a rising voice and a mounting color. "Any one man who says I'm afraid to show my face in the neighborhood, and I'll horsewhip him publicly before another day is over his head." Pedgift Senior helped himself to a pinch of snuff, and held it calmly in suspense, midway between his box and his nose. "You can horsewhip a man, sir, but you can't horsewhip a neighborhood," said the lawyer, in his politely epigrammatic manner. "We will fight our battle, if you please, without borrowing our weapons of the coachman yet awhile, at any rate." "But how are we to begin?" asked Allan, impatiently. "How am I to contradict the infamous things they say of me?" "There are two ways of stepping out of your present awkward position, sir, a short way and a long way," replied Pedgift Senior. "The short way, which is always the best, has occurred to me since I have heard of your proceedings in London from my son. I understand that you permitted him, after you received my letter, to take me into your confidence. I have drawn various conclusions from what he has told me, which I may find it necessary to trouble you with presently. In the meantime, I should be glad to know under what circumstances you went to London to make these unfortunate inquiries about Miss Gwilt. Was it your own notion to pay that visit to Mrs. Mandeville, or were you acting under the influence of some other person?" Allan hesitated. "I can't honestly tell you it was my own notion," he replied, and said no more. "I thought as much," remarked Pedgift Senior, in high triumph. "The short way out of our present difficulty, Mr. Armadale, lies straight through that other person, under whose influence you acted. That other person must be presented forthwith to public notice, and must stand in that other person's proper place. The name, if you please, sir, to begin with. We'll come to the circumstances directly." "I am sorry to say, Mr. Pedgift, that we must try the longest way, if you have no objection," replied Allan, quietly. "The short way happens to be a way I can't take on this occasion." The men who rise in the law are the men who decline to take "no" for an answer. Mr. Pedgift the elder had risen in the law, and Mr. Pedgift the elder now declined to take "no" for an answer. But all pertinacity, even professional pertinacity included, sooner or later finds its limits; and the lawyer, doubly fortified as he was by long experience and copious pinches of snuff, found his limits at the very outset of the interview. It was impossible that Allan could respect the confidence which Mrs. Milroy had treacherously affected to place in him. But he had an honest man's regard for his own pledged word, the regard which looks straight forward at the fact, and which never glances sidelong at the circumstances; and the utmost persistency of Pedgift Senior failed to move him a hairbreadth from the position which he had taken up. No is the strongest word in the English language, in the mouth of any man who has the courage to repeat it often enough, and Allan had the courage to repeat it often enough on this occasion. "Very good, sir," said the lawyer, accepting his defeat without the slightest loss of temper. "The choice rests with you, and you have chosen. We will go the long way. It starts, allow me to inform you, from my office, and it leads, as I strongly suspect, through a very miry road to Miss Gwilt." Allan looked at his legal adviser in speechless astonishment. "If you want to expose the person who is responsible in the first instance, sir, for the inquiries to which you unfortunately lent yourself," proceeded Mr. Pedgift the elder. "The only other alternative, in your present position, is to justify the inquiries themselves." "And how is that to be done?" inquired Allan. "By proving to the whole neighborhood, Mr. Armadale, what I firmly believe to be the truth, that the pet object of the public protection is an adventuress of the worst class, an undeniably worthless and dangerous woman. In plainer English still, sir, by employing time enough and money enough to discover the truth about Miss Gwilt." Before Allan could say a word in answer, there was an interruption at the door. After the usual preliminary knock, one of the servants came in. "I told you I was not to be interrupted," said Allan, irritably. "Good heavens! Am I never to have done with them? Another letter!" "Yes, sir," said the man, holding it out. "And," he added, speaking words of evil omen in his master's ears, "the person waits for an answer." Allan looked at the address of the letter, with a natural expectation of encountering the handwriting of the major's wife. The anticipation was not realized. His correspondent was plainly a lady, but the lady was not Mrs. Milroy. "Who can it be?" he said, looking mechanically at Pedgift Senior as he opened the envelope. Pedgift Senior gently tapped his snuff box, and said, without a moment's hesitation, "Miss Gwilt." Allan opened the letter. The first two words in it were the echo of the two words the lawyer had just pronounced. It was Miss Gwilt. Once more Allan looked at his legal adviser in speechless astonishment. "I have known a good many of them in my time, sir," explained Pedgift Senior, with a modesty equally rare and becoming in a man of his age. "Not as handsome as Miss Gwilt, I admit, but quite as bad, I dare say. Read your letter, Mr. Armadale, read your letter." Allan read these lines: "Miss Gwilt presents her compliments to Mr. Armadale, and begs to know if it will be convenient to him to favor her with an interview, either this evening or to-morrow morning. Miss Gwilt offers no apology for making her present request. She believes Mr. Armadale will grant it as an act of justice toward a friendless woman, whom he has been innocently the means of injuring, and who is earnestly desirous to set herself right in his estimation." Allan handed the letter to his lawyer in silent perplexity and distress. The face of Mr. Pedgift the elder expressed but one feeling when he had read the letter in his turn and had handed it back, a feeling of profound admiration. "What a lawyer she would have made," he exclaimed, fervently, "if she had only been a man!" "I can't treat this as lightly as you do, Mr. Pedgift," said Allan. "It's dreadfully distressing to me. I was so fond of her," he added, in a lower tone, "I was so fond of her once." Mr. Pedgift Senior suddenly became serious on his side. "Do you mean to say, sir, that you actually contemplate seeing Miss Gwilt?" he asked, with an expression of genuine dismay. "I can't treat her cruelly," returned Allan. "I have been the means of injuring her." "Without intending it, God knows. I can't treat her cruelly after that." "Mr. Armadale," said the lawyer, "you did me the honor, a little while since, to say that you considered me your friend. May I presume on that position to ask you a question or two before you go straight to your own ruin?" "Any questions you like," said Allan, looking back at the letter, the only letter he had ever received from Miss Gwilt. "You have had one trap set for you already, sir, and you have fallen into it. Do you want to fall into another?" "You know the answer to that question, Mr. Pedgift, as well as I do." "I'll try again, Mr. Armadale. We lawyers are not easily discouraged. Do you think that any statement Miss Gwilt might make to you, if you do see her, would be a statement to be relied on, after what you and my son discovered in London?" "She might explain what we discovered in London," suggested Allan, still looking at the writing, and thinking of the hand that had traced it. "Might explain it? My dear sir, she is quite certain to explain it. I will do her justice. I believe she would make out a case without a single flaw in it from beginning to end." That last answer forced Allan's attention away from the letter. the lawyer's pitiless common sense showed him no mercy. "If you see that woman again, sir," proceeded Pedgift Senior, "you will commit the rashest act of folly I ever heard of in all my experience. She can have but one object in coming here, to practice on your weakness for her. Nobody can say into what false step she may not lead you, if you once give her the opportunity. You admit yourself that you have been fond of her. Your attentions to her have been the subject of general remark. If you haven't actually offered her the chance of becoming Mrs. Armadale, you have done the next thing to it. And knowing all this, you propose to see her, and to let her work on you with her devilish beauty and her devilish cleverness, in the character of your interesting victim. You, who are one of the best matches in England. You, who are the natural prey of all the hungry single women in the community. I never heard the like of it. I never, in all my professional experience, heard the like of it. If you must positively put yourself in a dangerous position, Mr. Armadale," concluded Pedgift the elder, with the everlasting pinch of snuff held in suspense between his box and his nose, "there's a wild beast show coming to our town next week. Let in the tigress, sir. Don't let in Miss Gwilt." For the third time, Allan looked at his lawyer, and for the third time his lawyer looked back at him, quite unabashed. "You seem to have a very bad opinion of Miss Gwilt," said Allan. "The worst possible opinion, Mr. Armadale," retorted Pedgift Senior, coolly. "We will return to that when we have sent the lady's messenger about his business. Will you take my advice? Will you decline to see her?" "I would willingly decline. It would be so dreadfully distressing to both of us," said Allan. "I would willingly decline if only I knew how." "Bless my soul, Mr. Armadale, it's easy enough. Don't commit yourself in writing. Send out to the messenger, and say there's no answer." The short course thus suggested was a course which Allan positively declined to take. "It's treating her brutally," he said. "I can't and won't do it." Once more the pertinacity of Pedgift the elder found its limits, and once more that wise man yielded gracefully to a compromise. On receiving his client's promise not to see Miss Gwilt, he consented to Allan's committing himself in writing under his lawyer's dictation. The letter thus produced was modeled in Allan's own style. It began and ended in one sentence: "Mr. Armadale presents his compliments to Miss Gwilt, and regrets that he cannot have the pleasure of seeing her at Thorpe Ambrose." Allan had pleaded hard for a second sentence, explaining that he only declined Miss Gwilt's request from a conviction that an interview would be needlessly distressing on both sides. But his legal adviser firmly rejected the proposed addition to the letter. "When you say no to a woman, sir," remarked Pedgift Senior, "always say it in one word. If you give her your reasons, she invariably believes that you mean yes." Producing that little gem of wisdom from the rich mine of his professional experience, Mr. Pedgift the elder sent out the answer to Miss Gwilt's messenger, and recommended the servant to see the fellow, whoever he was, well clear of the house. "Now, sir," said the lawyer, "we will come back, if you like, to my opinion of Miss Gwilt. It doesn't at all agree with yours, I'm afraid. You think her an object of pity, quite natural at your age. I think her an object for the inside of a prison, quite natural at mine. You shall hear the grounds on which I form my opinion directly. Let me show you that I am in earnest by putting the opinion itself, in the first place, to a practical test. Do you think Miss Gwilt is likely to persist in paying you a visit, Mr. Armadale, after the answer you have just sent to her?" "Quite impossible!" cried Allan, warmly. "Miss Gwilt is a lady. After the letter I have sent to her, she will never come near me again." "There we join issue, sir," cried Pedgift Senior. "I say she will snap her fingers at your letter, which was one of the reasons why I objected to your writing it. I say she is in all probability waiting her messenger's return, in or near your grounds at this moment. I say she will try to force her way in here, before 24 hours more are over your head." "Egad, sir," cried Mr. Pedgift, looking at his watch, "it's only 7 o'clock now. she's bold enough, and clever enough, to catch you unawares this very evening. Permit me to ring for the servant. Permit me to request that you will give him orders immediately to say you are not at home. You needn't hesitate, Mr. Armadale. If you're right about Miss Gwilt, it's a mere formality. If I'm right, it's a wise precaution. Back your opinion, sir," said Mr. Pedgift, ringing the bell. "I back mine." Allan was sufficiently nettled, when the bell rang, to feel ready to give the order. But when the servant came in, past remembrances got the better of him, and the words stuck in his throat. "You give the order," he said to Mr. Pedgift, and walked away abruptly to the window. "You're a good fellow," thought the old lawyer, looking after him, and penetrating his motive on the instant. "The claws of that she devil shan't scratch you, if I can help it." The servant waited inexorably for his orders. "If Miss Gwilt calls here, either this evening or at any other time," said Pedgift Senior, "Mr. Armadale is not at home. Wait. If she asks when Mr. Armadale will be back, you don't know. Wait. If she proposes coming in and sitting down, you have a general order that nobody is to come in and sit down, unless they have a previous appointment with Mr. Armadale. Come," cried old Pedgift, rubbing his hands cheerfully when the servant had left the room. "I've stopped her out now, at any rate. The orders are all given, Mr. Armadale. We may go on with our conversation." Allan came back from the window. "The conversation is not a very pleasant one," he said. "No offense to you, but I wish it was over." "We will get it over as soon as possible, sir," said Pedgift Senior, still persisting, as only lawyers and women can persist, in forcing his way, little by little, nearer and nearer to his own object. "Let us go back, if you please, to the practical suggestion which I offered to you when the servant came in with Miss Gwilt's note. There is, I repeat, only one way left for you, Mr. Armadale, out of your present awkward position. You must pursue your inquiries about this woman to an end, on the chance, which I consider next to a certainty, that the end will justify you in the estimation of the neighborhood." "I wish to God I had never made any inquiries at all," said Allan. "Nothing will induce me, Mr. Pedgift, to make any more." "Why?" asked the lawyer. "Can you ask me why?" retorted Allan, hotly, "after your son has told you what we found out in London? Even if I had less cause to be sorry for Miss Gwilt than I have, even if it was some other woman, do you think I would inquire any further into the secret of a poor betrayed creature, much less expose it to the neighborhood? I should think myself as great a scoundrel as the man who has cast her out helpless on the world, if I did anything of the kind. I wonder you can ask me the question. Upon my soul, I wonder you can ask me the question." "Give me your hand, Mr. Armadale," cried Pedgift Senior, warmly. "I honor you for being so angry with me. The neighborhood may say what it pleases. You're a gentleman, sir, in the best sense of the word. Now," pursued the lawyer, dropping Allan's hand, and lapsing back instantly from sentiment to business, "just hear what I have got to say in my own defense. Suppose Miss Gwilt's real position happens to be nothing like what you are generously determined to believe it to be." "We have no reason to suppose that," said Allan, resolutely. "Such is your opinion, sir," persisted Pedgift. "Mine, founded on what is publicly known of Miss Gwilt's proceedings here, and on what I have seen of Miss Gwilt herself, is that she is as far as I am from being the sentimental victim you are inclined to make her out. Gently, Mr. Armadale, remember that I have put my opinion to a practical test, and wait to condemn it off hand until events have justified you. Let me put my points, sir. Make allowances for me as a lawyer, and let me put my points. You and my son are young men, and I don't deny that the circumstances on the surface appear to justify the interpretation which, as young men, you have placed on them. I am an old man. I know that circumstances are not always to be taken as they appear on the surface. and I possess the great advantage, in the present case, of having had years of professional experience among some of the wickedest women who ever walked this earth." Allan opened his lips to protest, and checked himself, in despair of producing the slightest effect. Pedgift Senior bowed in polite acknowledgment of his client's self restraint, and took instant advantage of it to go on. "All Miss Gwilt's proceedings," he resumed, "since your unfortunate correspondence with the major, show me that she is an old hand at deceit. The moment she is threatened with exposure of some kind, there can be no doubt, after what you discovered in London, she turns your honorable silence to the best possible account, and leaves the major's service in the character of a martyr. Once out of the house, what does she do next? She boldly stops in the neighborhood, and serves three excellent purposes by doing so. In the first place, she shows everybody that she is not afraid of facing another attack on her reputation. In the second place, she is close at hand to twist you round her little finger, and to become Mrs. Armadale, in spite of circumstances, if you and I allow her the opportunity. In the third place, if you and I are wise enough to distrust her, she is equally wise on her side, and doesn't give us the first great chance of following her to London, and associating her with her accomplices. Is this the conduct of an unhappy woman who has lost her character in a moment of weakness, and who has been driven unwillingly into a deception to get it back again?" "You put it cleverly," said Allan, answering with marked reluctance. "I can't deny that you put it cleverly." "Your own common sense, Mr. Armadale, is beginning to tell you that I put it justly," said Pedgift Senior. "I don't presume to say yet what this woman's connection may be with those people at Pimlico. All I assert is that it is not the connection you suppose. Having stated the facts so far, I have only to add my own personal impression of Miss Gwilt. I won't shock you, if I can help it. I'll try if I can't put it cleverly again. She came to my office, as I told you in my letter, no doubt to make friends with your lawyer, if she could. She came to tell me in the most forgiving and Christian manner that she didn't blame you." "Do you ever believe anybody, Mr. Pedgift?" interposed Allan. "Sometimes, Mr. Armadale," returned Pedgift the elder, as unabashed as ever. "I believe as often as a lawyer can. To proceed, sir. When I was in the criminal branch of practice, it fell to my lot to take instructions for the defense of women committed for trial from the women's own lips. Whatever other difference there might be among them, I got in time to notice among those who were particularly wicked and unquestionably guilty, one point in which they all resembled each other. Tall and short, old and young, handsome and ugly, they all had a secret self-possession that nothing could shake. On the surface they were as different as possible. Some of them were in a state of indignation, some of them were drowned in tears, some of them were full of pious confidence, and some of them were resolved to commit suicide before the night was out. But only put your finger suddenly on the weak point in the story told by any one of them, and there was an end of her rage, or her tears, or her piety, or her despair, and out came the genuine woman, in full possession of all her resources, with a neat little lie that exactly suited the circumstances of the case. Miss Gwilt was in tears, sir, becoming tears that didn't make her nose red, and I put my finger suddenly on the weak point in her story. Down dropped her pathetic pocket handkerchief from her beautiful blue eyes, and out came the genuine woman, with the neat little lie that exactly suited these circumstances. I felt 20 years younger, Mr. Armadale, on the spot. I declare I thought I was in Newgate again, with my notebook in my hand, taking my instructions for the defense." "The next thing you'll say, Mr. Pedgift," cried Allan angrily, "is that Miss Gwilt has been in prison." Pedgift Senior calmly rapped his snuff-box, and had his answer ready at a moment's notice. "She may have richly deserved to see the inside of a prison, Mr. Armadale. But in the age we live in, that is one excellent reason for her never having been near any place of the kind. A prison, in the present tender state of public feeling, for a charming woman like Miss Gwilt! My dear sir, if she had attempted to murder you or me, and if an inhuman judge and jury had decided on sending her to prison, the first object of modern society would be to prevent her going into it. And, if that couldn't be done, the next object would be to let her out again as soon as possible. Read your newspaper, Mr. Armadale, and you'll find we live in piping times for the black sheep of the community, if they are only black enough. I insist on asserting, sir, that we have got one of the blackest of the lot to deal with in this case. I insist on asserting that you have had the rare luck, in these unfortunate inquiries, to pitch on a woman who happens to be a fit object for inquiry, in the interests of the public protection. Differ with me as strongly as you please, but don't make up your mind finally about Miss Gwilt until events have put those two opposite opinions of ours to the test that I have proposed. A fairest test there can't be. I agree with you that no lady worthy of the name could attempt to force her way in here, after receiving your letter. But I deny that Miss Gwilt is worthy of the name, and I say she will try to force her way in here, in spite of you." "And I say she won't," retorted Allan, firmly. Pedgift Senior leaned back in his chair and smiled. There was a momentary silence, and in that silence the door bell rang. The lawyer and the client both looked expectantly in the direction of the hall. "No!" cried Allan, more angrily than ever. "Yes!" cried Pedgift Senior, contradicting him with the utmost politeness. They waited the event. The opening of the house door was audible, but the room was too far from it for the sound of voices to reach the ear as well. After a long interval of expectation, the closing of the door was heard at last. Allan rose impetuously and rang the bell. Mr. Pedgift the elder sat sublimely calm, and enjoyed, with a gentle zest, the largest pinch of snuff he had taken yet. "Anybody for me?" asked Allan, when the servant came in. The man looked at Pedgift Senior, with an expression of unutterable reverence, and answered, "Miss Gwilt." "I don't want to crow over you, sir," said Mr. Pedgift the elder, when the servant had withdrawn. "But what do you think of Miss Gwilt, now?" Allan shook his head in silent discouragement and distress. "Time is of importance, Mr. Armadale. After what has just happened, do you still object to taking the course I have had the honor of suggesting to you?" "I can't, Mr. Pedgift," said Allan. "I can't be the means of disgracing her in the neighborhood. I would rather be disgraced myself, as I am." "Let me put it in another way, sir. Excuse my persisting. You have been very kind to me and my family, and I have a personal interest, as well as a professional interest, in you. If you can't prevail on yourself to show this woman's character in its true light, will you take common precautions to prevent her doing any more harm? Will you consent to having her privately watched as long as she remains in this neighborhood?" For the second time Allan shook his head. "Is that your final resolution, sir?" "It is, Mr. Pedgift. But I am much obliged to you for your advice, all the same." Pedgift Senior rose in a state of gentle resignation, and took up his hat. "Good evening, sir," he said, and made sorrowfully for the door. Allan rose on his side, innocently supposing that the interview was at an end. Persons better acquainted with the diplomatic habits of his legal adviser would have recommended him to keep his seat. The time was ripe for Pedgift's postscript, and the lawyer's indicative snuff box was at that moment in one of his hands, as he opened the door with the other. "Good evening," said Allan. Pedgift Senior opened the door, stopped, considered, closed the door again, came back mysteriously with his pinch of snuff in suspense between his box and his nose, and repeating his invariable formula, "By the by, there's a point occurs to me. quietly resumed possession of his empty chair. Allan, wondering, took the seat, in his turn, which he had just left. Lawyer and client looked at each other once more, and the inexhaustible interview began again. Chapter 6.
Book the Third, Chapter 6 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Anthony Petronic. Chapter 6. Pedgift's Postscript. "I mentioned that a point had occurred to me, sir," remarked Pedgift Senior. "You did," said Allan. "Would you like to hear what it is, Mr. Armadale?" "If you please," said Allan. "With all my heart, sir. This is the point. I attach considerable importance, if nothing else can be done, to having Miss Gwilt privately looked after as long as she stops at Thorpe Ambrose. It struck me just now at the door, Mr. Armadale, that what you are not willing to do for your own security, you might be willing to do for the security of another person." "What other person?" inquired Allan. "A young lady who is a near neighbor of yours, sir. Shall I mention the name in confidence? Miss Milroy." Allan started and changed color. "Miss Milroy!" he repeated. "Can she be concerned in this miserable business?" "I hope not, Mr. Pedgift. I sincerely hope not." "I paid a visit in your interest, sir, at the cottage this morning," proceeded Pedgift Senior. "You shall hear what happened there, and judge for yourself. Major Milroy has been expressing his opinion of you pretty freely, and I thought it highly desirable to give him a caution. It's always the way with those quiet, addle-headed men. When they do once wake up, there's no reasoning with their obstinacy, and no quieting their violence. Well, sir, this morning I went to the cottage. The Major and Miss Neelie were both in the parlor. Miss not looking so pretty as usual, pale, I thought, pale, and worn, and anxious. Up jumps the addle-headed Major. I wouldn't give that, Mr. Armadale, for the brains of a man who can occupy himself for half his lifetime in making a clock. Up jumps the addle-headed Major. In the loftiest of manner, he actually tries to look me down. Ha, ha, ha! The idea of anybody looking me down at my time of life! I behaved like a Christian. I nodded kindly to old What's-o'clock. "Fine morning, Major," says I. "Have you any business with me?" says he. "Just a word," says I. Miss Neelie, like the sensible girl she is, gets up to leave the room. And what does her ridiculous father do? He stops her. "You needn't go, my dear. I have nothing to say to Mr. Pedgift," says this old military idiot, and turns my way and tries to look me down again. "You are Mr. Armadale's lawyer," says he. "If you come on any business relating to Mr. Armadale, I refer you to my solicitor. His solicitor is Darch, and Darch has had enough of me in business, I can tell you. My errand here, Major, does certainly relate to Mr. Armadale," says I, "but it doesn't concern your lawyer, at any rate, just yet. I wish to caution you to suspend your opinion of my client, or, if you won't do that, to be careful how you express it in public. I warn you that our turn is to come, and that you are not at the end yet of this scandal about Miss Gwilt. It struck me as likely that he would lose his temper when he found himself tackled in that way, and he amply fulfilled my expectations. He was quite violent in his language, the poor weak creature, actually violent with me. I behaved like a Christian again. I nodded kindly and wished him good morning. When I looked round to wish Miss Neelie good morning too, she was gone. "You seem restless, Mr. Armadale," remarked Pedgift Senior, as Allan, feeling the sting of old recollections, suddenly started out of his chair and began pacing up and down the room. I won't try your patience much longer, sir. I am coming to the point." "I beg your pardon, Mr. Pedgift," said Allan, returning to his seat, and trying to look composedly at the lawyer through the intervening image of Neelie which the lawyer had called up. "Well, sir, I left the cottage," resumed Pedgift Senior. "Just as I turned the corner from the garden into the park, Whom should I stumble upon but Miss Neelie herself, evidently on the lookout for me. "I want to speak to you for one moment, Mr. Pedgift," says she. "Does Mr. Armadale think me mixed up in this matter?" She was violently agitated, tears in her eyes, sir, of the sort which my legal experience has not accustomed me to see. I quite forgot myself. I actually gave her my arm, and led her away gently among the trees. A nice position to find me in, if any of the scandal-mongers of the town had happened to be walking in that direction. "My dear Miss Milroy," says I, "why should Mr. Armadale think you mixed up in it?" "You ought to have told her at once that I thought nothing of the kind!" exclaimed Allan, indignantly. "Why did you leave her a moment in doubt about it?" "Because I am a lawyer, Mr. Armadale," rejoined Pedgift Senior, dryly. "Even in moments of sentiment, under convenient trees, with a pretty girl on my arm, I can't entirely divest myself of my professional caution. Don't look distressed, sir, I pray. I set things right in due course of time. Before I left Miss Milroy, I told her in the plainest terms no such idea had ever entered your head." "Did she seem relieved?" asked Allan. "She was able to dispense with the use of my arm," replied old Pedgift, as dryly as ever, "and to pledge me to inviolable secrecy on the subject of our interview. She was particularly desirous that you should hear nothing about it. If you are at all anxious on your side to know why I am now betraying her confidence, I beg to inform you that her confidence related to no less a person than the lady who favored you with a call just now, Miss Gwilt." Allan, who had been once more restlessly pacing the room, stopped and returned to his chair. "Is this serious?" he asked. "Most serious, sir," returned Pedgift Senior. "I am betraying Miss Neelie's secret in Miss Neelie's own interest. Let us go back to that cautious question I put to her. She found some little difficulty in answering it, for the reply involved her in a narrative of the parting interview between her governess and herself. This is the substance of it. The two were alone when Miss Gwilt took leave of her pupil, and the words she used, as reported to me by Miss Neelie, were these. She said, 'Your mother has declined to allow me to take leave of her. Do you decline too?' Miss Neelie's answer was a remarkably sensible one for a girl of her age. 'We have not been good friends,' said she, 'and I believe we are equally glad to part with each other. But I have no wish to decline taking leave of you.' Saying that, she held out her hand. Miss Gwilt stood looking at her steadily, without taking it, and addressed her in these words: 'You are not Mrs. Armadale yet. Gently, sir, keep your temper. It's not at all wonderful that a woman, conscious of having her own mercenary designs on you, should attribute similar designs to a young lady who happens to be your near neighbor. Let me go on, please. Miss Neelie, by her own confession, and quite naturally, I think, was excessively indignant. She owns to of having answered, "You shameless creature, how dare you say that to me?" Miss Gwilt's rejoinder was rather a remarkable one. The anger, on her side, appears to have been of the cool, still venomous kind. "Nobody ever injured me, Miss Milroy," she said, "without sooner or later bitterly repenting it. You will bitterly repent it." She stood looking at her pupil for a moment in dead silence, and then left the room. Miss Neelie appears to have felt the imputation fastened on her in connection with you far more sensitively than she felt the threat. She had previously known, as everybody had known in the house, that some unacknowledged proceedings of yours in London had led to Miss Gwilt's voluntary withdrawal from her situation, and she now inferred, from the language addressed to her, that she was actually believed by Miss Gwilt to have set those proceedings on foot to advance herself and to injure her governess in your estimation. Gently, sir, gently. I haven't quite done yet. As soon as Miss Neelie had recovered herself, she went upstairs to speak to Mrs. Milroy. Miss Gwilt's abominable imputation had taken her by surprise, and she went to her mother first for enlightenment and advice. She got neither the one nor the other. Mrs. Milroy declared she was too ill to enter on the subject, and she has remained too ill to enter on it ever since. Miss Neelie applied next to her father. The Major stopped her the moment your name passed her lips. He declared he would never hear you mentioned again by any member of his family. She has been left in the dark from that time to this, not knowing how she might have been misrepresented by Miss Gwilt, or what falsehoods you might have been led to believe of her. At my age and in my profession, I don't profess to have any extraordinary softness of heart, but I do think, Mr. Armadale, that Miss Neelie's position deserves our sympathy." "I'll do anything to help her," cried Allan, impulsively. "You don't know, Mr. Pedgift, what reason I have." He checked himself, and confusedly repeated his first words. I'll do anything," he reiterated earnestly. "Anything in the world to help her." "Do you really mean that, Mr. Armadale? Excuse my asking, but you can very materially help Miss Neelie, if you choose." "How?" asked Allan. "Only tell me how." "By giving me your authority, sir, to protect her from Miss Gwilt." Having fired that shot point blank at his client, the wise lawyer waited a little to let it take its effect before he said any more. Allan's face clouded, and he shifted uneasily from side to side of his chair. "Your son is hard enough to deal with, Mr. Pedgift," he said, "and you are harder than your son." "Thank you, sir," rejoined the ready Pedgift, "in my son's name and my own, for a handsome compliment to the firm. If you wish to be of assistance to Miss Neelie," he went on, more seriously, "I have shown you the way. You can do nothing to quiet her anxiety which I have not done already. As soon as I assured her that no misconception of her conduct existed in your mind, she went away satisfied. Her governess's parting threat doesn't seem to have dwelt on her memory. I can tell you, Mr. Armadale, it dwells on mine. You know my opinion of Miss Gwilt, and you know what Miss Gwilt herself has done this very evening to justify that opinion even in your eyes. May I ask, after all that has passed, whether you think she is the sort of woman who can be trusted to confine herself to empty threats?" The question was a formidable one to answer. Forced steadily back from the position which he had occupied at the outset of the interview by the irresistible pressure of plain facts, Allan began for the first time to show symptoms of yielding on the subject of Miss Gwilt. "Is there no other way of protecting Miss Milroy but the way you have mentioned?" he asked, uneasily. "Do you think the Major would listen to you, sir, if you spoke to him?" asked Pedgift Senior, sarcastically. "I'm rather afraid he wouldn't honor me with his attention. Or perhaps you would prefer alarming Miss Neelie by telling her, in plain words, that we both think her in danger? Or suppose you send me to Miss Gwilt with instructions to inform her that she has done her pupil a cruel injustice. Women are so proverbially ready to listen to reason, and they are so universally disposed to alter their opinions of each other on application, especially when one woman thinks that the other woman has destroyed her prospect of making a good marriage. Don't mind me, Mr. Armadale. I'm only a lawyer, and I can sit waterproof under another shower of Miss Gwilt's tears." "Damn it, Mr. Pedgift, tell me in plain words what you want me to do," cried Allan, losing his temper at last. "In plain words, Mr. Armadale, I want to keep Miss Gwilt's proceedings privately under view, as long as she stops in this neighborhood. I answer for finding a person who will look after her delicately and discreetly, and I agree to discontinue even this harmless superintendence of her actions, if there isn't good reason shown for continuing it, to your entire satisfaction, in a week's time. I make that moderate proposal, sir, in what I sincerely believe to be Miss Milroy's interest, and I wait for your answer, yes or no." "Can't I have time to consider?" asked Allan, driven to the last helpless expedient of taking refuge in delay. "Certainly, Mr. Armadale, but don't forget, while you are considering, that Miss Milroy is in the habit of walking out alone in your park, innocent of all apprehension of danger, and that Miss Gwilt is perfectly free to take any advantage of that circumstance that Miss Gwilt pleases." "Do as you like!" exclaimed Allan in despair, "and for God's sake, don't torment me any longer. Popular prejudice may deny it, but the profession of the law is a practically Christian profession, in one respect at least. Of all the large collection of ready answers lying in wait for mankind on a lawyer's lips, none is kept in better working order than the soft answer which turneth away wrath. Pedgift Senior rose with the alacrity of youth in his legs, and the wise moderation of age on his tongue. "Many thanks, sir," he said, "for the attention you have bestowed on me. I congratulate you on your decision, and I wish you good evening." This time his indicative snuff-box was not in his hand when he opened the door, and he actually disappeared without coming back for a second postscript. Allan's head sank on his breast when he was finally left alone. "If it was only the end of the week," he thought longingly. "If I only had Midwinter back again!" As that aspiration escaped the client's lips, the lawyer got gaily into his gig. "Hi! Away, old girl!" cried Pedgift Senior, patting the fast-trotting mare with the end of his whip. "I never keep a lady waiting, and I've got business tonight with one of your own sex." End of Chapter 6. Recording by Michael Anthony Petronic. www.voiceoftemptation.biz.
Book the Third, Chapter 7 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Bowman. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Book 3, Chapter 7. The Martyrdom of Miss Gwilt. The outskirts of the little town of Thorpe Ambrose, on the side nearest to the great house, have earned some local celebrity as exhibiting the prettiest suburb of the kind to be found in East Norfolk. Here the villas and the gardens are for the most part built and laid out in excellent taste. The trees are in the prime of their growth, and the healthy common beyond the houses rises and falls in picturesque and delightful variety of broken ground. The rank, fashion, and beauty of the town make this place their evening promenade, and when a stranger goes out for a drive, if he leaves it to the coachman starts by way of the common, as a matter of course. On the opposite side, that is to say, on the side furthest from the great house, the suburbs, in the year 1851, were universally regarded as a sore subject by all persons zealous for the reputation of the town. Here nature was uninviting, man was poor, and social progress, as exhibited under the form of building, halted miserably. The streets dwindled feebly as they receded from the center of town into smaller and smaller houses, and died away on the barren open ground into an atrophy of skeleton cottages. Builders hereabout appeared to have universally abandoned their work in the first stage of its creation. Landholders set up poles on lost patches of ground, and, plaintively advertising that they were to let for building, raised sickly little crops meanwhile, in despair of finding a purchaser to deal with them. All the waste paper of the town seemed to float congenially to this neglected spot, and all the fretful children came and cried here, in charge of all the slatternly nurses who disgraced the place. If there was any intention in Thorpe Ambrose of sending a worn-out horse to the knackers, that horse was sure to be found waiting his doom in a field on this side of the town. No growth flourished in these desert regions but the arid growth of rubbish, and no creatures rejoiced but the creatures of the night, the vermin here and there in their beds, and the cats everywhere on the tiles. The sun had set, and the summer twilight was darkening. The fretful children were crying in their cradles. The horse destined for the knacker dozed forlorn in the field of his imprisonment. The cats waited stealthily in corners for the coming night. But one living figure appeared in the lonely suburb, the figure of Mr. Bashwood. But one faint sound disturbed the dreadful silence, the sound of Mr. Bashwood's softly stepping feet. Moving slowly past the heaps of bricks rising at intervals along the road, coasting carefully around the old iron and the broken tiles scattered here and there in his path, Mr. Bashwood advanced from the direction of the country toward one of the unfinished streets of the suburb. His personal appearance had been apparently made the object of some special attention. His false teeth were brilliantly white. His wig was carefully brushed. His mourning garments, renewed throughout, gleamed with the hideous and slimy gloss of cheap black cloth. He moved with a nervous jauntiness, and looked about him with a vacant smile. Having reached the first of the skeleton cottages, his watery eyes settled steadily for the first time on the view of the street before him. The next instant he started. His breath quickened. He leaned, trembling and flushing, against the unfinished wall at his side. A lady, still at some distance, was advancing toward him down the length of the street. "She's coming," he whispered, with a strange mixture of rapture and fear, of alternating color and paleness, showing itself in his haggard face. "I wish I was the ground she treads on. I wish I was the glove she's got on her hand." He burst ecstatically into those extravagant words, with a concentrated intensity of delight in uttering them that actually shook his feeble figure from head to foot. Smoothly and gracefully the lady glided nearer and nearer, until she revealed to Mr. Bashwood's eyes what Mr. Bashwood's instincts had recognized in the first instance: the face of Miss Gwilt. She was dressed with an exquisitely expressive economy of outlay. The plainest straw bonnet procurable, trimmed sparingly with the cheapest white ribbon, was on her head. Modest and tasteful poverty expressed itself in the speckless cleanliness and the modestly proportioned skirts of her light print gown, and in the scanty little mantilla of cheap black silk which she wore over it, edged with a simple frilling of the same material. The luster of her terrible red hair showed itself unshrinkingly in the plaited coronet above her forehead, and escaped in one vagrant love-lock, perfectly curled, that dropped over her left shoulder. Her gloves, fitting her like a second skin, were of the sober brown hue which is slowest to show signs of use. One hand lifted her dress daintily above the impurities of the road. The other held a little nosegay of the commonest garden flowers. Noiselessly and smoothly she came on, with a gentle and regular undulation of the print gown, with the love-lock softly lifted from moment to moment in the evening breeze, with her head a little drooped, and her eyes on the ground, in walk and look and manner, in every casual movement that escaped her, expressing that subtle mixture of the voluptuous and the modest, which, of the many attractive extremes that meet in women, is in a man's eyes the most irresistible of all. "Mr. Bashwood!" she exclaimed, in loud, clear tones indicative of the utmost astonishment. "What a surprise to find you here! I thought none but the wretched inhabitants ever ventured near this side of the town. Hush!" she added quickly in a whisper. "You heard right when you heard that Mr. Armadale was going to have me followed and watched. There's a man behind one of the houses. We must talk out loud of indifferent things, and look as if we had met by accident. Ask me what I am doing, out loud, directly. You shall never see me again if you don't instantly leave off trembling and do what I tell you." She spoke with a merciless tyranny of eye and voice, with a merciless use of her power over the feeble creature whom she addressed. Mr. Bashwood obeyed her in tones that quavered with agitation, and with eyes that devoured her beauty in a strange fascination of terror and delight. "I'm trying to earn a little money by teaching music," she said, in the voice intended to reach the spy's ears. "If you are able to recommend me any students, Mr. Bashwood, your good word will oblige me. Have you been in the grounds to-day?" she went on, dropping her voice again in a whisper. "Has Mr. Armadale been near the cottage? Has Miss Milroy been out of the garden?" "No? Are you sure? Look out for them tomorrow, and next day, and next day. They are certain to meet and make it up again, and I must, and will know of it. Hush! Ask me my terms for teaching music." "What are you frightened about? It's me the man's after, not you. Louder than when you asked me what I was doing just now. Louder, or I won't trust you any more. I'll go to someone else." Once more Mr. Bashwood obeyed. "Don't be angry with me," he murmured, faintly, when he had spoken the necessary words. "My heart beats so you'll kill me." "You poor old dear," she whispered back, with a sudden change in her manner, with an easy satirical tenderness. "What business have you with a heart at your age? Be here tomorrow at the same time, and tell me what you have seen in the grounds. My terms are only 5 shillings a lesson," she went on, in her louder tone. "I'm sure that's not much, Mr. Bashwood. I give such long lessons, and I get all my pupils' music half price." She suddenly dropped her voice again, and looked him brightly into instant subjection. "Don't let Mr. Armadale out of your sight tomorrow. If that girl manages to speak to him, and if I don't hear of it, I'll frighten you to death. If I do hear of it, I'll kiss you. Hush! Wish me good night, and go on to the town, and leave me to go the other way. I don't want you. I'm not afraid of the man behind the houses. I can deal with him by myself. Say good night, and I'll let you shake hands. Say it louder, and I'll give you one of my flowers, if you'll promise not to fall in love with it." She raised her voice again. "Good night, Mr. Bashwood. Don't forget my terms. 5 shillings a lesson, and the lessons last an hour at a time, and I get all my pupils' music half price, which is an immense advantage, isn't it?" She slipped a flower into his hand, frowned him into obedience, and smiled to reward him for obeying. At the same moment, lifted her dress again above the impurities of the road, and went on her way with a dainty and indolent deliberation, as a cat goes on her way when she has exhausted the enjoyment of frightening a mouse. Left alone, Mr. Bashwood turned to the low cottage wall near which he had been standing, and resting himself on it wearily, looked at the flower in his hand. His past existence had disciplined him to bear disaster and insult, as few happier men could have borne them. But it had not prepared him to feel the master passion of humanity for the first time at the dreary end of his life, in the hopeless decay of a manhood that had withered under the double blight of conjugal disappointment and parental sorrow. "Oh, if I was only young again!" murmured the poor wretch, resting his arms on the wall and touching the flower with his dry, fevered lips, in a stealthy rapture of tenderness. "She might have liked me when I was 20." He suddenly started back into an erect position, and stared about him in vacant bewilderment and terror. "She told me to go home," he said, with a startled look. "Why am I stopping here?" He turned and hurried on to the town, in such dread of her anger, if she looked round and saw him, that he never so much as ventured a backward glance at the road by which she had retired, and never detected the spy dogging her footsteps under the cover of the empty houses and the brick heaps by the roadside. Smoothly and gracefully, carefully preserving the speckless integrity of her dress, never hastening her pace, and never looking aside to the right hand or the left, Miss Gwilt pursued her way toward the open country. The suburban road branched off at its end in 2 directions. On the left, the path wound through a ragged little coppice to the grazing grounds of a neighboring farm. On the right, it led across a hillock of waste land to the high road. Stopping a moment to consider, but not showing the spy that she suspected him by glancing behind her while there was a hiding place within his reach, Miss Gwilt took the path across the hillock. "I'll catch him there," she said to herself, looking up quietly at the long straight line of the empty high road. Once on the ground that she had chosen for her purpose, she met the difficulties of the position with perfect tact and self-possession. After walking some 30 yards along the road, she let her nosegay drop, half turned around in stooping to pick it up, saw the man stopping at the same moment behind her, and instantly went on again, quickening her pace little by little, until she was walking at the top of her speed. The spy fell into the snare laid for him. Seeing the night coming, and fearing that he might lose sight of her in the darkness, he rapidly lessened the distance between them. Miss Gwilt went on faster and faster, till she plainly heard his footstep behind her, then stopped, turned, and met the man face to face the next moment. "My compliments to Mr. Armadale," she said, "and tell him I've caught you watching me." "I'm not watching you, miss," retorted the spy, thrown off his guard by the daring plainness of the language in which she had spoken to him. Miss Gwilt's eyes measured him contemptuously from head to foot. He was a weakly, undersized man. She was the taller, and quite possibly the stronger of the two. "Take off your hat, you blackguard, when you speak to a lady," she said, and tossed his hat in an instant across a ditch by which they were standing, into a pool on the other side. This time the spy was on his guard. He knew, as well as Miss Gwilt knew, the use which might be made of the precious minutes, if he turned his back on her and crossed the ditch to recover his hat. "It's well for you you're a woman," he said, standing scowling at her bareheaded in the fast darkening light. Miss Gwilt glanced sidelong down the onward vista of the road, and saw, through the gathering obscurity, the solitary figure of a man rapidly advancing toward her. Some women would have noticed the approach of a stranger at that hour, and in that lonely place, with a certain anxiety. Miss Gwilt was too confident in her own powers of persuasion not to count on the man's assistance beforehand, whoever he might be, because he was a man. She looked back at the spy with a redoubled confidence in herself, and measured him contemptuously from head to foot for the second time. "I wonder whether I'm strong enough to throw you after your hat," she said. "I'll take a turn and consider it." She sauntered on a few steps toward the figure advancing along the road. The spy followed her close. "Try it," he said brutally. "You're a fine woman. You're welcome to put your arms round me, if you like." As the words escaped him, he too saw the stranger for the first time. He drew back a step and waited. Miss Gwilt, on her side, advanced a step and waited too. The stranger came on, with the lithe, light step of a practiced walker, swinging a stick in his hand and carrying a knapsack on his shoulders. A few paces nearer, and his face became visible. He was a dark man. His black hair was powdered with dust, and his black eyes were looking steadfastly forward along the road before him. Miss Gwilt advanced with the first signs of agitation she had shown yet. "Is it possible?" she said softly. "Can it really be you?" It was Midwinter, on his way back to Thorpe Ambrose after his fortnight among the Yorkshire moors. He stopped and looked at her in breathless surprise. The image of the woman had been in his thoughts at the moment when the woman herself spoke to him. "Miss Gwilt!" he exclaimed, and mechanically held out his hand. She took it and pressed it gently. "I should have been glad to see you at any time," she said. "You don't know how glad I am to see you now. May I trouble you to speak to that man? He's been following me and annoying me all the way from the town." Midwinter stepped past her without uttering a word. Faint as the light was, the spy saw what was coming in his face, and turned instantly, leaped the ditch by the roadside. Before Midwinter could follow, Miss Gwilt's hand was on his shoulder. "No," she said, "you don't know who his employer is." Midwinter stopped and looked at her. "Strange things have happened since you left us," she went on. "I have been forced to give up my situation, and I am followed and watched by a paid spy. Don't ask who forced me out of my situation, and who pays the spy, at least not just yet. I can't make up my mind to tell you till I am a little more composed. Let the wretch go. Do you mind seeing me safe back to my lodging? It's in your way home. May I ask for the support of your arm? My little stock of courage is quite exhausted." She took his arm and clung close to it. The woman who had tyrannized over Mr. Bashwood was gone, and the woman who had tossed the spy's hat into the pool was gone. A timid, shrinking, interesting creature filled the fair skin and trembled on the symmetrical limbs of Miss Gwilt. She put her handkerchief to her eyes. "They say necessity has no law," she murmured faintly. "I'm treating you like an old friend. God knows I want one." They went on toward the town. She recovered herself with a touching fortitude. She put her handkerchief back in her pocket, and persisted in turning the conversation on Midwinter's walking tour. "It is bad enough to be a burden on you," she said, gently pressing on his arm as she spoke. "I mustn't distress you as well. Tell me, where have you been, and what have you seen? Interest me in your journey. Help me to escape from myself." They reached the modest little lodging in the miserable little suburb. Miss Gwilt sighed and removed her glove before she took Midwinter's hand. "I have taken refuge here," she said simply. "It is clean and quiet. I am too poor to want or expect more. We must say good-bye, I suppose, unless—" She hesitated modestly, and satisfied herself by a quick look around that they were unobserved. "Unless you would like to come in and rest a little. I feel so gratefully toward you, Mr. Midwinter. Is there any harm, do you think, in my offering you a cup of tea?" The magnetic influence of her touch was thrilling through him while she spoke. Change and absence, to which he had trusted to weaken her hold on him, had treacherously strengthened it instead. A man exceptionally sensitive, a man exceptionally pure in his past life, he stood hand in hand in the tempting secrecy of the night with the first woman who had exercised over him the all-absorbing influence of her sex. At his age and in his position, who could have left her? The man, with a man's temperament, doesn't live who could have left her. Midwinter went in. A stupid, sleepy lad opened the house door. Even he, being a male creature, brightened under the influence of Miss Gwilt. "The urn, John," she said kindly, "and another cup and saucer. I'll borrow your candle to light my candles upstairs, then I won't trouble you any more to-night." John was wakeful and active in an instant. "No trouble, miss," he said, with an awkward civility. Miss Gwilt took his candle with a smile. "How good people are to me," she whispered innocently to Midwinter, as she led the way upstairs to the little drawing-room on the first floor. She lit the candles, and turning quickly on her guest, stopped him at the first attempt he made to remove the knapsack from his shoulders. "No," she said gently. "In the good old times there were occasions when the ladies unarmed their knights. I claim the privilege of unarming my knight." Her dexterous fingers intercepted his at the straps and buckles, and she had the dusty knapsack off before he could protest against her touching it. They sat down at the one little table in the room. It was very poorly furnished, but there was something of the dainty neatness of the woman who inhabited it, in the arrangement of the few poor ornaments on the chimney-piece, in the one or two prettily bound volumes on the chiffonier, in the flowers on the table, and the modest little work-basket in the window. "Women are not all coquettes," she said, as she took off her bonnet and mantilla, and laid them carefully on a chair. I won't go on into my room and look in my glass and make myself smart. You shall take me just as I am." Her hands moved about among the tea things with a smooth, noiseless activity. Her magnificent hair flashed crimson in the candlelight as she turned her head hither and thither, searching with an easy grace for the things she wanted in the tray. Exercise had heightened the brilliancy of her complexion, and had quickened the rapid alternations of expression in her eyes, the delicious languor that stole over them when she was listening or thinking, the bright intelligence that flashed from them softly when she spoke. In the lightest words she said, in the least thing she did, there was something that gently solicited the heart of the man who sat with her. Perfectly modest in her manner, possessed to perfection of all the graceful restraints and refinements of a lady, she had all the allurements that feast the eye, all the siren invitations that seduce the sense, a subtle suggestiveness in her silence, and a sexual sorcery in her smile. "Should I be wrong," she asked, suddenly suspending the conversation which she had thus far persistently restricted to the subject of Midwinter's walking tour, "if I guessed that you have something on your mind, something which neither my tea nor my talk can charm away? Are men as curious as women? Is the something me?" Midwinter struggled against the fascination of looking at her and listening to her. "I am very anxious to hear what has happened since I have been away," he said. "But I am still more anxious, Miss Gwilt, not to distress you by speaking of a painful subject." She looked at him gratefully. "It is for your sake that I have avoided the painful subject," she said, toying with her spoon among the dregs in her empty cup. "But you will hear about it from others if you don't hear about it from me. And you ought to know why you found me in that strange situation, and why you see me here. Pray remember one thing, to begin with. I don't blame your friend, Mr. Armadale. I blame the people whose instrument he is." Midwinter started. "Is it possible," he began, "that Allan can be in any way answerable—" He stopped, and looked at Miss Gwilt in silent astonishment. She gently laid her hand on his. "Don't be angry with me for only telling the truth," she said. "Your friend is answerable for everything that has happened to me. Innocently answerable, Mr. Midwinter, I firmly believe. We are both victims. He is the victim of his position as the richest single man in the neighborhood, and I am the victim of Miss Milroy's determination to marry him." "Miss Milroy?" repeated Midwinter, more and more astonished. "Why, Allan himself told me—" He stopped again. "He told you that I was the object of his admiration? Poor fellow! He admires everybody. His head is almost as empty as this," said Miss Gwilt, smiling indicatively into the hollow of her cup. She dropped the spoon, sighed, and became serious again. "I am guilty of the vanity of having let him admire me," she went on penitently, "without the excuse of being able, on my side, to reciprocate even the passing interest that he felt in me. I don't undervalue his many admirable qualities, or the excellent position he can offer to his wife. But a woman's heart is not to be commanded. No, Mr. Midwinter, not even by the fortunate master of Thorpe Ambrose, who commands everything else." She looked him full in the face as she uttered that magnanimous sentiment. His eyes dropped before hers, and his dark color deepened. He had felt his heart leap in him at the declaration of her indifference to Allan. For the first time since they had known each other, his interest now stood self-revealed before him as openly adverse to the interests of his friend. "I have been guilty of the vanity of letting Mr. Armadale admire me, and I have suffered for it," resumed Miss Gwilt. "If there had been any confidence between my pupil and me, I might have easily satisfied her that she might become Mrs. Armadale, if she could, without having any rivalry to fear on my part. Miss Milroy disliked and distrusted me from the first. She took her own jealous view, no doubt, of Mr. Armadale's thoughtless attentions to me. It was her interest to destroy the position, such as it was, that I held in his estimation, and it is quite likely her mother assisted her. Mrs. Milroy had her motive also, which I am really ashamed to mention, for wishing to drive me out of the house. Anyhow, the conspiracy has succeeded. I have been forced, with Mr. Armadale's help, to leave the Major's service. Don't be angry, Mr. Midwinter. Don't form a hasty opinion. I dare say Miss Milroy has some good qualities, though I have not found them out, and I assure you again and again that I don't blame Mr. Armadale. I only blame the people whose instrument he is." "How is he their instrument? How can he be the instrument of any enemy of yours?" asked Mr. Midwinter. "Pray excuse my anxiety, Miss Gwilt. Allan's good name is as dear to me as my own." Miss Gwilt's eyes turned full on him again, and Miss Gwilt's heart abandoned itself innocently to an outburst of enthusiasm. "How I admire your earnestness!" she said. "How I like your anxiety for your friend! Oh, if women could only form such friendships! Oh, you happy, happy men!" Her voice faltered, and her convenient teacup absorbed her for the third time. "I would give all the little beauty I possess," she said, "if I could only find such a friend as Mr. Armadale has found in you. I never shall, Mr. Midwinter. I never shall. Let us go back to what we were talking about. I can only tell you how your friend is concerned in my misfortune by telling you something first about myself. I am like many other governesses. I am the victim of sad domestic circumstances. It may be weak of me, but I have a horror of alluding to them among strangers. My silence about my family and my friends exposes me to misinterpretation in my dependent position. Does it do me any harm, Mr. Midwinter, in your estimation?" "God forbid," said Midwinter, fervently. "There is no man living," he went on, thinking of his own family story, "who has better reason to understand and respect your silence than I have." Miss Gwilt seized his hand impulsively. "Oh," she said, "I knew it! The first moment I saw you, I knew that you too had suffered, that you too had sorrows which you kept sacred. Strange, strange sympathy! I believe in mesmerism. Do you?" She suddenly recollected herself and shuddered. "Oh, what have I done? What must you think of me?" she exclaimed, as he yielded to the magnetic fascination of her touch, and, forgetting everything but the hand that lay warm in his own, bent over it and kissed it. "Spare me," she said faintly, as she felt the burning touch of his lips. "I am so friendless. I am so completely at your mercy." He turned away from her, and hid his face in his hands. He was trembling, and she saw it. She looked at him while his face was hidden from her. She looked at him with a furtive interest and surprise. "How that man loves me!" she thought. "I wonder whether there was a time when I might have loved him." The silence between them remained unbroken for some minutes. He had felt her appeal to his consideration as she had never expected or intended him to feel it. He shrank from looking at her or from speaking to her again. "Shall I go on with my story?" she asked. "Shall we forget and forgive on both sides?" A woman's inveterate indulgence for every expression of a man's admiration, which keeps within the limits of personal respect, curved her lips gently into a charming smile. She looked down meditatively at her dress, and brushed a crumb off her lap with a little flattering sigh. "I was telling you," she went on, "of my reluctance to speak to strangers of my sad family story. It was in that way, as I afterward found out, that I laid myself open to Miss Milroy's malice and Miss Milroy's suspicion. Private inquiries about me were addressed to the lady who was my reference, at Miss Milroy's suggestion in the first instance, I have no doubt. I'm sorry to say this was not the worst of it. By some underhand means, of which I am quite ignorant, Mr. Armadale's simplicity was imposed on, and when application was made secretly to my reference in London, it was made, Mr. Midwinter, through your friend." Midwinter suddenly rose from his chair and looked at her. The fascination that she exercised over him, powerful as it was, became a suspended influence, now that the plain disclosure came plainly at last from her lips. He looked at her, sat down again, like a man bewildered, without uttering a word. "Remember how weak he is," pleaded Miss Gwilt, gently, "and make allowances for him as I do. The trifling accident of his failing to find my reference at the address given him seems, I can't imagine why, to have excited Mr. Armadale's suspicion. At any rate, he remained in London. What he did there it is impossible for me to say. I was quite in the dark. I knew nothing. I distrusted nobody. I was as happy in my little round of duties as I could be with a pupil whose affections I had failed to win, when one morning, to my indescribable astonishment, Major Milroy showed me a correspondence between Mr. Armadale and himself. He spoke to me in his wife's presence. Poor creature, I make no complaint of her. Such affliction as she suffers excuses everything. I wish I could give you some idea of the letters between Major Milroy and Mr. Armadale. But my head is only a woman's head, and I was so confused and distressed at the time. All I can tell you is that Mr. Armadale chose to preserve silence about his proceedings in London, under circumstances which made that silence a reflection on my character. The Major was most kind. His confidence in me remained unshaken, but could his confidence protect me against his wife's prejudice and his daughter's ill will? Oh, the hardness of women to each other! Oh, the humiliation if men only knew some of us as we really are! What could I do? I couldn't defend myself against mere imputations, and I couldn't remain in my situation, after a slur had been cast on me. My pride, heaven help me, I was brought up like a gentlewoman, and I have sensibilities that are not blunted even yet. My pride got the better of me, and I left my place. Don't let it distress you, Mr. Midwinter. There's a bright side to the picture. The ladies in the neighborhood have overwhelmed me with kindness. I have the prospect of getting pupils to teach. I'm spared the mortification of going back to be a burden on my friends. The only complaint I have to make is, I think, a just one. Mr. Armadale has been back at Thorpe Ambrose for some days. I have entreated him by letter to grant me an interview, to tell me what dreadful suspicions he has of me, and to let me set myself right in his estimation. Would you believe it? He has declined to see me, under the influence of others, not of his own free will, I'm sure. Cruel, isn't it? But he has even used me more cruelly still. He persists in suspecting me. It is he who is having me watched. Oh, Mr. Midwinter, don't hate me for telling you what you must know. The man you found persecuting me and frightening me tonight was only earning his money, after all, as Mr. Armadale's spy." Once more Midwinter started to his feet, and this time the thoughts that were in him found their way into words. "I can't believe it! I won't believe it!" he exclaimed indignantly. "If the man told you that, the man lied. I beg your pardon, Miss Gwilt. I beg your pardon from the bottom of my heart. Pray don't think I doubt you. I only say there is some dreadful mistake. I'm not sure that I understand as I ought all that you have told me, but this last infamous meanness of which you think Allan guilty, I do understand. I swear to you he is incapable of it. Some scoundrel has been taking advantage of him. Some scoundrel has been using his name. I'll prove it to you, if you will only give me time. Let me go and clear it up at once. I can't rest. I can't bear to think of it. I can't even enjoy the pleasure of being here. Oh," he burst out desperately, "I'm sure you feel for me after what you have said. I feel so for you." He stopped in confusion. Miss Gwilt's eyes were looking at him again, and Miss Gwilt's hand had found its way once more into his own. "You are the most generous of living men," she said softly. "I will believe what you tell me to believe. Go," she added in a whisper, suddenly releasing his hand and turning away from him. "For both our sakes, go." His heart beat fast. He looked at her as she dropped into a chair and put her handkerchief to her eyes. For one moment he hesitated. The next, he snatched up his knapsack from the floor and left her precipitately, without a backward look or a parting word. She rose when the door closed on him. Change came over the instant she was alone. The color faded out of her cheeks, the beauty died out of her eyes. Her face hardened horribly with a silent despair. "It's even baser work than I bargained for," she said, "to deceive him." After pacing to and fro in the room for some minutes, she stopped wearily before the glass over the fireplace. "You strange creature," she murmured, leaning her elbows on the mantelpiece and languidly addressing the reflection of herself in the glass. "Have you got any conscience left? And has that man roused it?" The reflection of her face changed slowly. The color returned to her cheeks. The delicious languor began to suffuse her eyes again. Her lips parted gently, and her quickening breath began to dim the surface of the glass. She drew back from it. After a moment's absorption in her own thoughts, with a start of terror, "What am I doing?" she asked herself in a sudden panic of astonishment. "Am I mad enough to be thinking of him in that way?" She burst into a mocking laugh, and opened her desk on the table recklessly with a bang. "It's high time I had some talk with Mother Jezebel," she said, and sat down to write to Mrs. Oldershaw. "I have met with Mr. Midwinter," she began, "under very lucky circumstances, and I have made the most of my opportunity. He has just left me for his friend Armadale, and one of two good things will happen tomorrow. If they don't quarrel, the doors of Thorpe Ambrose will be opened to me again at Mr. Midwinter's intercession. If they do quarrel, I shall be the unhappy cause of it, and I shall find my way in for myself, on the purely Christian errand of reconciling them." She hesitated at the next sentence, wrote the first few words of it, scratched them out again, and petulantly tore the letter into fragments, and threw the pen to the other side of the room. Turning quickly on her chair, she looked at the seat which Midwinter had occupied, her foot restlessly tapping the floor, and her handkerchief thrust like a gag between her clenched teeth. "Young as you are," she thought, with her mind reviving the image of him in the empty chair, "there has been something out of the common in your life, and I must and I will know it." The house clock struck the hour and roused her. She sighed, and, walking back to the glass, wearily loosened the fastenings of her dress, wearily removed the studs from the chemisette beneath it, and put them on the chimney-piece. She looked indolently at the reflected beauties of her neck and bosom as she unplaited her hair and threw it back in one great mass over her shoulders. "Fancy," she thought, "if he saw me now!" She turned back to the table and sighed again as she extinguished one of the candles and took the other in her hand. "Midwinter?" she said as she passed it through the folding doors of the room to her bedchamber. "I don't believe in his name, to begin with." The night had advanced by more than an hour before Midwinter was back again at the great house. Twice, well as the homeward way was known to him, he had strayed out of the right road. The events of the evening, the interview with Miss Gwilt herself, after his fortnight's solitary thinking of her, the extraordinary change that had taken place in her position since he had seen her last, and the startling assertion of Allan's connection with it, had all conspired to throw his mind into a state of ungovernable confusion. The darkness of the cloudy night added to his bewilderment. Even the familiar gates of Thorpe Ambrose seemed strange to him. When he tried to think of it, it was a mystery to him how he had reached the place. The front of the house was dark and closed for the night. Midwinter went around to the back. The sound of men's voices as he advanced caught his ear. They were soon distinguishable as the voices of the first and second footmen. The subject of the conversation between them was their master. "I'll bet you an even half-crown he's driven out of the neighborhood before the week is over his head," said the first footman. "Done," said the second. "He isn't as easy driven as you think." "Isn't he?" retorted the other. "He'll be mobbed if he stops here. I tell you again, he's not satisfied with the mess he's gotten into already. I know it for certain. He's having the governess watched." At those words, Midwinter mechanically checked himself before he turned the corner of the house. His first doubt of the result of his meditated appeal to Allan ran through him like a sudden chill. The influence exercised by the voice of public scandal is a force which acts in opposition to the ordinary law of mechanics. It is strongest, not by concentration, but by distribution. To the primary sound we may shut our ears, but the reverberation of it in echoes is irresistible. On his way back, Midwinter's one desire had been to find Allan up, and to speak with him immediately. His one hope now was to gain time to contend with the new doubts and to silence the new misgivings. His one present anxiety was to hear that Allan had gone to bed. He turned the corner of the house and presented himself before the men smoking their pipes in the back garden. As soon as their astonishment allowed them to speak, they offered to rouse their master. Allan had given his friend up for that night, and had gone to bed about a half an hour since. "It was my master's particular order, sir," said the head footman, "that he was to be told of it if you came back." "It is my particular request," returned Midwinter, "that you won't disturb him." The men looked at each other wonderingly as he took his candle and left them. End of Book the Third, Chapter 7. Recording by Greg Bowman.